The palace gates have always held secrets, but on this particular night, the air around Buckingham Palace carried a silence so heavy that even the world's press, gathered anxiously outside, seemed unwilling to breathe too loudly. It was not the kind of silence that precedes celebration or ceremony. It was the silence of crisis, the kind that settles in when something irreversible is about to unfold. Behind those gilded doors, King Charles summoned his closest advisors, senior royals, and confidants for what would later be described as one of the most consequential emergency meetings in modern royal history. At the center of this storm was not the monarchy itself, but the son who once symbolized its promise, Prince Harry. And within minutes, that son's world would be turned upside down, his title stripped away not by public opinion, not by scandal alone, but by the very hand of his father, the king. But how did it come to this? How did a prince born into privilege, adored by the public as the mischievous younger son of Diana, the boy who walked behind his mother's coffin with the eyes of the world upon him, find himself standing at the precipice of disinheritance? This introduction will peel back those layers, walking you through the forces that collided on this night. A father's struggle between duty and love, a son's insistence on freedom over loyalty, and a monarchy desperate to survive in an age of relentless scrutiny. This is not just a tale of titles and crowns. It is a human story, one of betrayal, heartbreak, and a bond between father and son stretched to its breaking point. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The beginning of this conflict was not the meeting itself, but the years that led up to it. Harry's decision to step away from royal duties, often referred to as Megxit, was not just a logistical withdrawal from royal engagements. It was a seismic shift in the fabric of the monarchy. He and Meghan Markle, his wife, sought independence, freedom from the constraints of the firm, and the ability to carve out their own path. But freedom came with consequences. With every interview, every documentary, every public revelation about life inside the palace, Harry was not just reclaiming his voice. He was eroding the institution's shield of silence. For a monarchy that has survived centuries by mastering the art of discretion, Harry's candor was a kind of betrayal. And betrayals, when stacked one upon another, eventually forced the crown to act. Imagine, for a moment, the scene inside the room that night. The king seated at the head of a polished mahogany table, his expression grave but unreadable. Camilla beside him, her gaze fixed, perhaps torn between her role as consort and her knowledge of the fragile dynamics at play. William, the heir apparent, likely watching with both frustration and weariness, knowing that his brother's shadow has haunted his every step since childhood. And, pragmatic and loyal to the crown above all else, perhaps the steeliest presence in the room. Advisors shuffling notes, speaking in hushed tones. And in the midst of this assembly, the topic no one wanted to confront, but everyone knew was inevitable: Harry's future as a prince of the realm. The middle of our story deepens with the recognition that titles in the royal family are not mere ornaments. They are currency, anchors of identity, and instruments of power. For Harry, the title of prince is not only a birthright, but also a constant reminder of the life he left behind. For Charles, however, it is a symbol of authority that must align with loyalty to the monarchy. If a prince ceases to serve, if he turns his back on the institution, can he still carry the title without tarnishing the crown? This is the dilemma that weighed on Charles's shoulders as he listened to his advisors lay out the risks of inaction. The monarchy is fragile in ways the public does not always see. It survives on perception, on continuity, on the belief that it remains above the chaos of ordinary life. And Harry, for all his charm and defiance, had become a liability to that illusion. Here lies the heart of the story, the personal colliding with the political. Charles is not just a monarch, but a father. He remembers Harry as the boy who once ran barefoot through palace gardens, the young man who laughed too loudly at official functions, the son who inherited Diana's fire and compassion. To strip him of his title is to wound him deeply, to fracture a bond already weakened by distance and mistrust. Yet Charles is also the king, and kings do not act for themselves alone. They act for the crown, for history, for the survival of something larger than any individual. This is the impossible burden Charles carried into that emergency meeting. The end of the introduction is where curiosity must peak, where the viewer is left both stunned and eager to journey further. What was said in that room? Did anyone plead for mercy, for a pause, for reconciliation before the decree was made? Or was the decision already written long before Harry set foot in California, long before the interviews, long before the memoirs that bared his wounds to the world? What we know is that when the meeting ended, one truth had crystallized. Harry's identity as prince was no longer his to claim. A father had drawn a line in history, and a son had been cast adrift from the very institution that defined him. The call for an emergency meeting inside Buckingham Palace did not come with the usual pomp of a scheduled royal gathering. There were no carefully drafted press releases, no ceremonial carriages lining up, no smiling faces for the cameras. Instead, it was abrupt, discreet, and urgent. Couriers moved swiftly down long corridors, phones rang behind closed doors, and within hours, the most senior figures of the royal household had been summoned to one of the most consequential meetings of King Charles's reign. The reason? A growing storm around Prince Harry that could no longer be contained by silence. The palace has always been an institution that thrives on timing. Everything from state dinners to military ceremonies operates like clockwork, designed to show the monarchy as a symbol of stability. So when an emergency meeting is called, it signals more than trouble. It signals crisis. To insiders, this was not simply about addressing a wayward prince. It was about safeguarding the very fabric of the monarchy. The decision to summon everyone at once was deliberate. Charles wanted no delay, no leaks, and no outside interference. This was to be settled within the walls of the palace, away from the glaring flashbulbs of photographers waiting at the gates. As limousines and discreet black cars began pulling into the courtyard, whispers filled the streets. Reporters stationed nearby knew something unusual was unfolding. Staffers, normally tight-lipped, were visibly tense. Security details were doubled, guards shifted uneasily at their posts, and yet no one dared reveal the truth of what was coming. Inside, the palace halls were buzzing with anticipation and dread. Advisors shuffled documents, whispering strategies in corners, preparing to brief the king. Every move had weight. Every detail mattered. At the heart of the summons was the question of Harry's future within the monarchy. For months, perhaps years, discussions had been simmering behind closed doors. His interviews, his memoir, his relentless criticism of the institution. These were not just family squabbles, they were global headlines. And with every revelation, the palace's silence was tested. How much could they ignore before the institution itself looked weakened? How long could they allow a prince to carry a title while publicly challenging the very system it represented? The decision to act now was not random. There were immediate pressures. Reports had surfaced suggesting Harry and Meghan were preparing another round of public disclosures, possibly in a new documentary series. There were rumors of legal disputes involving security arrangements for their visits to the UK. Add to this the strain of declining public support for the monarchy in some quarters, and the equation became explosive. Charles could not afford to wait any longer. The summons also reflected something more personal. The king's health had become an undercurrent in conversations across the UK. Though his role as monarch was firmly established, there were whispers of stress, strain, and the immense burden he carried. In this context, Harry's actions were no longer just irritations. They were distractions from the king's duty to unify the nation. For Charles, clarity was needed, and clarity demanded confrontation. Picture the scene as William entered the palace that night, his face set in grim determination. For years, he had watched his younger brother tear away at the institution they were both born to protect. He had been patient, perhaps even hopeful for reconciliation, but the weight of responsibility bore heavily on him. If the monarchy was to survive his father's reign and eventually transition to his own, difficult choices had to be made. Stripping Harry of his title, though unthinkable once, now seemed necessary. And, 2. Walk those corridors with purpose. Known for her blunt pragmatism, she had little tolerance for drama and even less patience for what she saw as betrayal. For her, the monarchy was not a stage for personal grievances, but an institution larger than any individual. She had long argued for decisive action when it came to Harry, and this meeting was an opportunity to make her case. Camilla's presence added another dimension. As queen consort, she understood the fragility of the monarchy's public image better than most. Having faced years of scrutiny herself, she knew how quickly perception could become reality. To her, allowing Harry to continue as prince while openly challenging the crown was untenable. She would not voice it as harshly as Anne, but her conviction was clear. The monarchy must come first. When Charles finally entered the chamber, silence fell. The king's expression was weary but resolute, the weight of his crown evident in the heaviness of his step. He did not need to raise his voice. The gravity of the moment was enough to command attention. He looked around the table at the familiar faces, family, advisors, confidants, and for a moment, he hesitated. This was not merely a political decision. This was a father preparing to cut away a part of his own legacy. The advisors began their briefings. They laid out the risks of inaction, dwindling trust in the monarchy, headlines that mocked the institution, a generation of young people increasingly questioning the crown's relevance. They reminded the king that titles are not just symbolic. They are the lifeblood of continuity. If a title could be used to undermine the institution, then what did it mean at all? And then came the harder truth. By allowing Harry to remain a prince while living outside the duties of the crown, Charles risked sending a message that the monarchy could be both inside and outside, both loyal and disloyal, both bound and free. That contradiction threatened to unravel centuries of tradition. If the monarchy was to endure, lines had to be drawn. For the king, the decision to summon this meeting was not just about controlling Harry. It was about making a statement to the nation, to the Commonwealth, and to the world. The monarchy is not a voluntary association. It is an institution built on duty, loyalty, and sacrifice. And if even a son of the king could not uphold those values, then he could not carry the title. The night stretched on as voices rose and fell. Some argued for compassion, others for firmness. But beneath it all was a growing sense of inevitability. This was not a question of if, but when. The emergency summons was not simply a response to crisis. It was the beginning of a final reckoning. By the time the advisors concluded their points, and the family exchanged weary glances, one truth had settled like a shadow across the room. Harry's title was hanging by a thread. And with each passing moment, the thread grew weaker. The fracture between Prince Harry and the crown did not happen overnight. It was years in the making, a slow accumulation of wounds, misunderstandings, and decisions that piled up until reconciliation seemed more like a dream than a possibility. To understand why King Charles was prepared to take such a drastic step during the emergency meeting, one must first understand the depth of Harry's estrangement and how it evolved into one of the most public royal rifts of the modern age. Harry's early years were defined by contrast. On one hand, he was the beloved spare, the carefree younger son whose cheeky grin and rebellious antics made headlines, but also endeared him to the public. On the other hand, he grew up under the shadow of immense tragedy. The loss of his mother, Princess Diana, was not just a private heartbreak, it was a global spectacle. Harry, walking behind her coffin at just 12 years old, became an image burned into the minds of millions. That moment shaped him in ways the world would later come to see. Distrust of the press, a yearning for normalcy, and a deep resentment toward the institution that, in his eyes, failed to protect her. Even as a teenager, Harry's relationship with the crown was marked by tension. The monarchy thrived on discipline, tradition, and controlled appearances, while Harry sought adventure, freedom, and often escaped into recklessness. His youthful missteps, nights out in London, controversial costumes, and military escapades were tabloid fodder. Yet, behind the stories was a young man grappling with grief and identity. To the public, he was a flawed but lovable prince. To the institution, he was a liability they had to manage carefully. That perception of being managed rather than supported would later fuel his resentment. The military provided Harry with a sense of purpose that the palace could not. Serving in Afghanistan, wearing the uniform, and standing shoulder to shoulder with fellow soldiers gave him an identity beyond prince. He was not coddled, he was challenged, not shielded, but respected. Those years were among the happiest in his life because, for once, he was judged not by his bloodline, but by his actions. Yet, even this chapter carried its complications. His deployments were cut short because of the risks tied to his royal status. And again, Harry felt the weight of an institution that treated him differently, not as a man, but as a symbol. The crown had interrupted the one thing that gave him fulfillment, reinforcing the gap between who he wanted to be and who the monarchy demanded he remain. When Meghan Markle entered Harry's life, the cracks widened. Meghan represented something Harry craved: independence from the royal script. Their love story was passionate, quick, and unapologetic, but it collided almost immediately with the rigid expectations of the crown. Meghan was American, biracial, divorced, and outspoken, a modern woman who did not fit neatly into the royal mold. To Harry, that made her perfect. To the monarchy, it made her problematic. What followed was a cultural and personal clash that played out in headlines around the world. Meghan was scrutinized, criticized, and at times vilified by segments of the British press. Harry, recalling his mother's treatment, saw history repeating itself. His instinct was not to protect the crown, but to protect his wife, even if it meant turning his back on everything he had been born into. The decision to step back from royal duties in 2020 was framed by Harry and Meghan as a compromise. They hoped to carve out a half-in, half-out role that would allow them to support the Queen while building their own financial independence. But for the palace, that was unacceptable. The monarchy thrives on absolute clarity. One is either inside or outside, loyal or estranged. This misalignment became the first official split, and with it came a cascade of consequences. Harry relinquished his military roles, a devastating personal loss, and the couple relocated to California. Physically and symbolically, Harry had crossed the Atlantic and left behind the crown's embrace. Yet leaving did not end the relationship, it inflamed it. From Oprah Winfrey's bombshell interview to the Netflix series and Harry's memoir, Spare, every disclosure widened the chasm. Harry spoke of feeling like an outsider within his own family, of unaddressed trauma, of arguments with William, and of a father he described as distant and conflicted. These were not just family grievances shared in private. They were confessions broadcast globally. For the monarchy, built on silence and mystique, this was unforgivable. For Harry, it was liberation. But liberation comes at a cost. Each revelation not only deepened the public's understanding of Harry's pain, but also cemented his alienation from the crown. He was no longer seen as the loyal prince who had served his country. He was now a critic, an outsider wielding his royal title as a platform for truths the monarchy did not want told. And here lies the heart of the fracture. Harry believed he was defending his family and his mother's memory, while the crown believed he was betraying centuries of duty. The fractured relationship also carried practical consequences. Questions arose about security when Harry visited the UK, about his children's titles, and about whether he should be included in official royal events. Every occasion became a battlefield of protocol and principle. At the Queen's funeral, Harry's presence was respectful but strained, his interactions with William awkward, his role diminished. Even in grief, the fracture was undeniable. Charles, as both father and king, has struggled with this reality. He has longed for reconciliation, but each step forward was followed by 2 steps back. Private conversations were leaked, trust was broken, and attempts at bridge-building failed. The emergency meeting was not born of a single insult or headline. It was the culmination of years of erosion, of a son pulling away and a crown unable to bend. The significance of Harry's fractured relationship with the crown is not limited to personal pain. It is a mirror of the monarchy's struggle to adapt in a modern world. Younger generations see Harry as a symbol of rebellion, someone willing to break free from outdated traditions. Older generations see him as a warning of disloyalty, proof that even royal blood can falter. This duality is what makes his story so compelling and so dangerous to the institution. As the emergency meeting unfolded, every participant carried this history in their minds. They were not simply deciding the fate of a title. They were reckoning with years of broken trust, public spectacle, and private heartbreak. Harry's fractured bond with the crown had reached its breaking point, and the king knew that whatever decision he made would echo for generations. And so the question lingers: can a monarchy survive when its own blood turns against it? Can a father ever truly sever ties with his son, or is the fracture a wound that will never heal, no matter what titles are stripped away? These are the questions that hung in the air as the crown prepared to make its move, questions that would define not just Harry's future, but the very story of the modern British monarchy. The role of a monarch has always been described as a balancing act, one foot planted in the weight of history, the other cautiously stepping into the uncertainty of the present. For King Charles, the dilemma he faced regarding his youngest son was more than a political decision. It was a torment that blended the duties of his crown with the emotions of his heart. At its core, it was the cruel question every royal must eventually confront. When the survival of the monarchy collides with the bonds of family, which must prevail? Charles was no stranger to difficult choices. His life had been defined by scrutiny, duty, and sacrifice. As a boy, he was molded by the rigid expectations of a future king. As a man, his marriage to Diana and the turbulence that followed made him a figure of both sympathy and scorn. As monarch, he inherited not only a crown but the responsibility of ensuring its survival in an era that questions its very existence. Yet nothing in those decades of experience had prepared him for the task of stripping his son of the title that defined him. The dilemma began with the dual identities Charles carried. On one hand, he was the king of the United Kingdom, the sovereign charged with protecting the dignity and continuity of the institution. On the other, he was a father who once rocked Harry in his arms, who once saw in him the spark of Diana's compassion and the promise of a new generation. To act against Harry was to act against himself as a father. To do nothing was to risk the credibility of the crown. That impossible tension sat heavy on Charles's shoulders as he convened the emergency meeting. The advisors who surrounded Charles pressed him with facts and strategy. They spoke of polling data showing the monarchy's approval ratings slipping among younger Britons, of newspaper editorials questioning why a prince could publicly criticize the institution while still enjoying its privileges, of Commonwealth leaders quietly asking whether the monarchy could remain a unifying symbol when its own house was divided. They reminded him that titles are not just words but instruments of power and prestige, and that failing to act decisively risked making the monarchy appear weak. Their advice was cold, calculated, and necessary. But behind every word was the echo of something Charles could not ignore: the face of his son. In his private reflections, Charles often wrestled with the legacy of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. She had ruled with restraint, never letting personal feelings interfere with her public duties. She had endured scandal after scandal with composure, projecting stability even when her family was in turmoil. Charles admired that strength, but he also knew he was not his mother. He felt deeply, often too deeply, and carried guilt for his own past missteps. The monarchy had survived Diana, survived Andrew, survived scandal after scandal. But this was different. This was Harry, his son, turning his fire not against outsiders, but against the family itself. That was harder to contain. The dilemma was sharpened by the timing. Charles was not a young man beginning his reign with decades of opportunity ahead. He was already in the twilight of his years, aware that his reign would be shorter than his mother's. He could not afford long, drawn-out uncertainty. Decisions had to be made swiftly and firmly to preserve stability for William's eventual succession. The idea of leaving behind a fractured monarchy weighed heavily on him. If Harry's rebellion was not addressed now, what precedent would it set for the future? Would the monarchy unravel on William's watch because Charles had hesitated? Yet, no matter how he reasoned, the heart resisted. Charles had seen the damage estrangement could do. He had lived through icy silences with his own parents, through decades of tension with Diana, through the constant reminder that royals are often bound by duty, but broken by love. Did he want to repeat that cycle with Harry? Did he want history to remember him as the king who cast out his son, or as the father who tried, against all odds, to keep the family intact? The emergency meeting was not the first time Charles had faced this choice. There had been earlier opportunities, when Harry and Meghan first announced their departure, when the Oprah interview aired, when Harry's memoir hit shelves. Each time, Charles delayed. He hoped time would heal, that silence would cool tempers, that reconciliation might be possible. But time had only deepened the divide. Each headline, each revelation, each new chapter of Harry's public truth-telling made the monarchy look passive, reactive, and vulnerable. Advisors warned that hesitation was no longer an option. The monarchy needed clarity, and clarity demanded action. One of the most painful elements of Charles's dilemma was the presence of William in the equation. William, the heir, had been patient for years, but his patience was wearing thin. He had borne the brunt of Harry's criticism in the press, endured the strain of their broken brotherhood, and carried the heavy weight of preparing for kingship while watching his younger sibling dismantle the institution. William's counsel was clear. The monarchy could not afford ambiguity. To preserve the crown, Harry had to be stripped of his title. For Charles, agreeing with William was both reassuring and devastating. It meant aligning with duty, but it also meant further alienating one son in favor of another. The dilemma was not just emotional. It was symbolic. The monarchy itself is a story told across centuries, where every act by a sovereign becomes part of history. If Charles stripped Harry of his title, he would be remembered as a monarch who chose the institution over his son. If he allowed Harry to keep it, he risked being remembered as weak, a king who allowed personal hesitation to endanger the crown. Either path would define his reign, and neither offered comfort. What made the choice even harder was the legacy of Diana. Harry was her son as much as Charles's. Diana had always fought for her boys to be treated as human beings first and princes second. She had challenged the institution's coldness, demanded warmth where there was only protocol. In many ways, Harry was carrying forward her defiance. For Charles to punish him now felt, in part, like punishing Diana's memory. Yet Charles also knew that Diana's shadow haunted everything, and that the monarchy could not be ruled by ghosts of the past. He had to make decisions for the living, for the future, even if it meant pain in the present. By the time Charles entered the chamber that evening, his dilemma had reached its breaking point. He could no longer delay, no longer balance on the knife edge of indecision. Around the table were people waiting for leadership, waiting for clarity, waiting for him to be more than a father. He was the king, and the king had to act. The dilemma of Charles is the dilemma of monarchy itself. Family versus institution, love versus duty, humanity versus history. That night, as the discussions stretched late into the evening, Charles carried the full weight of those contradictions on his shoulders. He knew that no matter what he decided, a part of him would break. The only question that remained was whether it would be the crown or his bond with his son that shattered under the strain. The emergency meeting had been called with such haste that even the most seasoned courtiers felt the weight of its urgency. Unlike the carefully choreographed state events the palace was known for, this gathering carried none of the pageantry. It was stripped down, raw, and tense. The mahogany table in the chamber was surrounded by the figures whose voices mattered most in the monarchy's survival, and for the first time in years, all of them were aligned in one thing. Something had to be done about Harry. Yet the way forward was anything but unanimous. The room was thick with silence at first, a silence that carried centuries of tradition and the burden of the crown itself. Charles sat at the head, the lines on his face more pronounced than usual, the crown invisible but heavier than ever. To his right, Camilla, poised and sharp, her expression betraying little but her eyes flickering with a cautious determination. Further down, William leaned forward, his posture taut, jaw set, eyes burning with a mixture of frustration and resolve. And sat across, composed as always, her hands folded neatly on the table, her presence radiating the steeliness she had inherited from her mother. The advisors, dressed in dark suits, shuffled papers nervously, their voices low as they whispered among themselves before the king signaled for the meeting to begin. It was an unusual gathering not because of the topic. Harry had been a subject of concern for years, but because of the rawness of the decision about to be taken. Titles had been stripped before in royal history, but rarely from someone so close, someone still so visible to the public. This was not the case of a distant duke caught in scandal or a minor royal fading into obscurity. This was the son of the king, the brother of the future monarch, the boy who had once symbolized the hope of Diana's legacy. Stripping him of his title would not be a footnote. It would be a seismic event. The advisors began the conversation with their briefings. Their voices were measured, rehearsed, but beneath the polish was urgency. They presented data on public opinion, noting that while sympathy for Harry existed, frustration with his continued criticisms of the monarchy had grown. They reminded the king of recent headlines that painted the institution as weak, unable to control even its own. They spoke of whispers within the Commonwealth, leaders questioning the example being set. Their message was clear: indecision was more dangerous than action. William was the first family member to speak. His voice, though calm, carried a sharp edge honed by years of restraint. He spoke not only as a brother, but as the heir. "We cannot move forward like this," he said firmly. He reminded the king that every revelation Harry made about the family, every documentary, every interview, was a strike at the monarchy's credibility. To William, this was not just about personal betrayal, but about survival. If we allow him to carry the title while tearing down everything it stands for, what does that say about us? About the crown itself? His words cut through the air, leaving little room for sentiment. And followed, her tone blunt, unvarnished, practical. She had little interest in the emotional back and forth. To her, the matter was simple. The monarchy was built on duty, and Harry had abandoned that duty. "You cannot have it both ways," she said, her voice steady. "You are either in or out." Harry chose out. The crown must do the same. She reminded Charles that the monarchy had survived far worse storms by being decisive. Wavering now would not only embolden critics, but weaken the entire institution. Camilla's intervention was more measured. She acknowledged the pain Charles must feel, but she framed her words with a realism born of her own experience. She knew better than anyone how fragile public opinion could be. She spoke of perception, of how the monarchy's image abroad had shifted since Harry's departure, of how the crown could not afford the appearance of indulgence. "The people respect strength," she said softly but firmly. "They respect clarity. What they cannot respect is hesitation." Her words were not as harsh as William's or Anne's, but they pressed Charles toward the same conclusion. The king listened, his expression unreadable, his fingers resting on the table as though weighing each word. Yet there was another layer to the voices in the room, not spoken, but felt. The silence between arguments was filled with memory. Each person there remembered Harry not only as a prince, but as a child, a brother, a nephew. The laughter that once filled the palace corridors, the mischievous energy that set him apart, the charm that had made him a public favorite. That memory lingered, softening the edges of the debate, but it could not erase the present reality. One advisor dared to voice what many thought, but hesitated to say. He asked what message this decision would send to Harry's children. Archie and Lilibet, though far removed from royal duties, carried titles themselves. What would it mean for them to grow up knowing their father had been stripped of his? Would this fuel bitterness for generations, or would it serve as a clear lesson about loyalty and consequence? The question hung in the air, heavy, without an answer. As the voices continued, Charles's dilemma sharpened into focus. He was surrounded by conviction, William's firmness, Anne's pragmatism, Camilla's realism, the advisor's strategy. But in his heart, the voice of a father still whispered. Could he truly strip his son of the title that defined him? Could he truly take that step, knowing it would fracture whatever bond remained between them? Every argument around the table pointed to yes, but the silence within him screamed hesitation. The debate stretched late into the night, each voice adding weight to the decision. No one argued for leniency, no one suggested waiting longer. The urgency was clear, action must be taken. Yet beneath the united front was a divergence in tone. William pressed with frustration and with stern clarity, Camilla with quiet firmness, the advisors with cold logic. Each voice echoed in Charles's mind, forming a chorus that demanded leadership. And then the room fell silent again, all eyes turning to the king. They had made their cases. The voices had been heard. Now the burden lay on him alone. No discussion about Prince Harry's fractured ties with the monarchy could unfold without Meghan Markle's presence looming over every word, every glance, every decision. Though she was not physically in the room during the emergency meeting, her shadow lingered in every argument and in every uneasy silence. To the royal family, Meghan was not merely Harry's wife. She was the catalyst, the spark that had turned simmering tensions into open conflict. To some, she represented liberation for Harry. To others, she was the reason the monarchy now faced its most visible crisis in decades. The story of Meghan's arrival into the royal family is often told as a fairy tale turned nightmare. She entered Harry's life at a time when he was deeply searching for something beyond royal duty. He was drawn to her strength, her independence, her refusal to bow to the suffocating traditions that had defined his existence. Meghan was not raised to accept things as they were. She was raised to challenge, to question, to redefine. This was exhilarating to Harry but alarming to the crown. From the moment their relationship became public, the press went into overdrive, dissecting her every move. Unlike the more traditional path taken by Kate Middleton, Meghan's entry was disruptive. She brought a perspective the palace had never truly encountered. Outspoken, American, biracial, and unafraid to defend herself. In the eyes of many courtiers, this was where the trouble began. The institution thrives on silence, on the idea that royals do not explain themselves, do not answer back, do not enter public debates. Meghan, however, could not understand why she should remain quiet when attacked. Her decision to defend herself, and by extension Harry, created a fissure that the palace could not ignore. What might have been managed privately soon spilled into the open, fueling a press war that only deepened Harry's resentment toward his family. By the time Harry and Meghan decided to step away from royal duties, the narrative within the palace had shifted. It was no longer seen as Harry being pulled away by love, but as Harry being pushed away by influence. Advisors whispered that Meghan had isolated him, convinced him of betrayal, and turned him against his family. Whether or not this was true mattered less than the perception. Inside the monarchy, perception is power, and Meghan had become the lightning rod for blame. During the emergency meeting, her name was not shouted or accused, but it did not need to be. William, in his sharp rebukes, implied her role when he spoke of how Harry's behavior had changed after his marriage. And, pragmatic as ever, saw Meghan as an outsider who had never understood the monarchy's sacred duty. Even Camilla, who had once been an outsider herself, struggled to reconcile Meghan's relentless independence with the compromises required of royal life. To them, Meghan was not only Harry's wife, but the embodiment of everything that threatened to tear him from the crown. Yet Meghan's shadow was not only a source of blame, it was also a shield for Harry. To him, she was not the cause of his rebellion, but the partner who gave him the courage to act. Without Meghan, would Harry have ever taken the step of leaving royal life? Perhaps not. She became, in his eyes, both his ally and his protector, someone who understood the suffocating weight of public scrutiny and stood beside him in defiance. For Harry, Meghan's presence was proof that he could choose love and freedom over tradition and duty. For the monarchy, this was precisely the problem. What made Meghan's role so complex was that she carried both truth and illusion. The media framed her as manipulative, but she also represented the modern world's challenge to monarchy itself. In a society that values transparency, equality, and independence, Meghan was the living embodiment of those ideals. The institution, however, thrives on hierarchy, secrecy, and continuity. The clash was inevitable. Her very presence asked a question the monarchy could not answer. Could an ancient institution bend enough to include someone so different, or would it break trying? In the emergency meeting, the shadow of Meghan also extended into the discussion of optics. Stripping Harry of his title would not only affect him, it would inevitably be seen as punishment of the couple. Advisors warned that the decision would be cast by international media as retaliation against Meghan, a woman of color who had spoken openly about her struggles within the royal family. Such a perception risked inflaming accusations of bias, further damaging the monarchy's global image. This concern was not trivial. The Commonwealth, filled with nations deeply conscious of colonial history, was watching. Any decision regarding Harry carried the risk of being read as a decision against Meghan. Charles sat quietly as these points were raised, his face heavy with the weight of consequence. He knew that Meghan had complicated Harry's relationship with the crown, but he also knew she had brought him happiness. That paradox was painful. Stripping Harry of his title would not just sever father from son. It would sever husband from wife in the eyes of the world, turning Meghan into the face of a controversy she had not personally attended. Charles understood this, but he also knew the institution could not bend around one woman's story. The question hung over the chamber. Was Harry's rebellion truly his own, or was it Meghan's influence? The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Harry had long been restless within the confines of royalty, but Meghan gave him the means and the resolve to act on that restlessness. She was both scapegoat and partner, blamed for what he might have done anyway, but also credited for giving him the strength to see it through. This duality haunted the conversation, making it impossible to separate Harry's choices from Meghan's presence. As the meeting pressed forward, the silence around Meghan spoke louder than words. Everyone in the room knew her role, even if they framed it differently. For William and Anne, she was the outsider who pushed Harry over the edge. For Charles, she was the woman who complicated his son's loyalty but also gave him joy. For the advisors, she was the factor that made every decision about optics as well as duty. And for Harry, though absent, she was the very reason he would never fully submit to the crown again. The moment the discussion could no longer circle around hypotheticals, the chamber grew still. For hours, arguments had been made, advice offered, emotions restrained, yet the question remained unanswered. Would King Charles take the irrevocable step of stripping his son of the title of prince? No one wanted to speak the words aloud, because to do so was to cross a line that once seemed unthinkable. But silence has its own weight, and it pressed down on the room until Charles finally straightened in his chair and prepared to do what no father wishes to do: cut his own son adrift from the very identity he was born with. The announcement did not come suddenly, like a thunderclap. It was measured, deliberate, the product of a man who knew that every word he spoke would echo not just within those palace walls, but across the globe. Charles cleared his throat, his hands clasped on the polished wood of the table, his gaze fixed on no one in particular. His voice, though calm, carried the gravitas of centuries of monarchy behind it. He spoke of duty, of loyalty, of the survival of the crown. He acknowledged the pain of the decision, but he framed it as necessary, as the kind of act a king must take when the survival of the institution outweighs the bonds of the private man. And then, with the quiet certainty of inevitability, he declared that Harry could no longer carry the title of prince. The silence that followed was deafening. Those present had argued for this outcome, but to hear it pronounced was something else entirely. William sat rigid, his jaw tightening, eyes flicking downward as though absorbing the finality of the moment, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, the expression of a woman who had long argued for clarity and had now seen it delivered. Camilla remained still, her features composed, but her eyes betraying the faintest glimmer of unease. The advisors scribbled notes, already considering how this would be presented to the public, how the wording would shape perception, how the institution would justify what had just occurred. Yet the weight of the moment was not in the reactions of those around the table. It was in the absence of the one person whose life had just been changed forever. Harry was not there to hear the words. He was thousands of miles away, across the ocean, perhaps unaware that in that instant, a defining part of his identity had been stripped away. There was no confrontation, no chance to argue, no chance to plead. Only the decision of a father king, handed down like a decree from history itself. The absence made it more brutal. To lose one's title in a face-to-face confrontation would have been painful. To lose it without a voice in the room was devastating. The symbolism of that declaration stretched far beyond the immediate family. Stripping Harry of his title was not just an internal family matter. It was a message to the world. It was the crown drawing a line in the sand, declaring that loyalty was non-negotiable, that one could not be both prince and critic. It was a warning to the future. Titles are privileges bound by duty, not unconditional rights. For the monarchy, it was survival. For Harry, it was exile. But what did that moment mean emotionally for Charles himself? Though he masked it with kingly composure, those closest to him knew he was breaking inside. To strip Harry of his title was to acknowledge that reconciliation might never come, that his son's path had diverged so completely that there was no bridge left to build. It was the final acknowledgement that the family he once dreamed of uniting under his reign could not exist as he had hoped. The pain of that realization, though hidden, weighed on him as heavily as the crown on his head. The echoes of the decision spread quickly through the palace. Courtiers whispered in corridors, staffers exchanged hushed words, and within hours, preparations were being made for the announcement that would inevitably reach the public. Every detail mattered: the phrasing of the statement, the timing of its release, the tone it would strike. The monarchy's strength lies not just in its actions, but in how those actions are perceived, and this decision would need to be explained in a way that preserved dignity while acknowledging heartbreak. Outside the palace, the implications were already being considered. How would the press react? How would Harry respond? How would the public, divided in its sympathies, interpret the stripping of a title so intrinsically tied to Diana's son? These questions hung in the air, unanswered, but unavoidable. The monarchy had acted, but the fallout was only beginning. Within the chamber, as Charles's words settled into history, each person reflected silently. William, though outwardly composed, could not escape the sense of loss. He had argued for this outcome, but it did not bring victory. Only the painful awareness that his brother was now further away than ever, and felt a grim satisfaction, believing the monarchy had chosen survival. But even she could not deny the tragedy of a father cutting off his son. Camilla thought of the optics, of the storm to come, of how Meghan would inevitably frame this in the public eye. And Charles, sitting in silence, wondered whether he had chosen the crown over his son, or whether, by trying to save one, he had lost both. The stripping of Harry's title was more than a royal decree. It was the moment when centuries of tradition collided with the raw, painful realities of family conflict. It was a decision born not of malice but of desperation, a last attempt to preserve the dignity of an institution struggling to survive in the modern age. And though the meeting would continue, though advisors would discuss strategies and family members would voice their opinions, the heart of the matter had already been decided. Harry was no longer a prince in the eyes of the crown. From the moment he was born, William's destiny had been mapped out with precision. He would inherit the throne, he would carry the weight of continuity, and he would become the embodiment of the monarchy's future. This destiny made his role in the stripping of Harry's title both inevitable and painful. Though Charles was the one who delivered the final decree, William's voice had carried immense influence in shaping the outcome. The heir's role was not only to protect the crown for his father, but also to prepare the ground for his own reign. And in William's eyes, Harry's continued presence as prince threatened both. In the days leading up to the emergency meeting, William had been vocal in private. He had spoken candidly to advisors, emphasizing that the monarchy could not afford ambiguity. He argued that every time Harry appeared in the media, every time he released another book or gave another interview, he leveraged the prestige of his title to attack the very institution that gave it meaning. To William, this was a betrayal of the deepest order, not just of family, but of duty. He reminded those around him that Diana's legacy was not only about compassion and openness, but also about the dignity she carried even in the face of adversity. In William's view, Harry had abandoned dignity for spectacle. But William's position was not purely pragmatic. It was also deeply personal. For years, he and Harry had been framed as a unit, the brothers walking side by side through grief, the next generation of royals bringing freshness to the institution. That image had been shattered. The rows between them had become public knowledge. Shouting matches, accusations, the infamous altercation described in Harry's memoir. William, who had always shouldered the burden of being the responsible one, now saw his brother as a destabilizing force. The hurt of that betrayal ran deep, and though William rarely let emotion guide his public actions, in this matter his personal wounds fueled his determination. During the meeting itself, William's presence was commanding. He did not raise his voice, but his words carried the weight of someone who knew the monarchy's survival depended on decisive action. He leaned forward, hands clasped, speaking with the confidence of a man who had grown accustomed to preparing for kingship. He argued that keeping Harry as a prince while he lived in California, outside the duties of the crown, created an untenable precedent. If one can walk away from duty yet keep the privileges, he said, then what does it mean to serve at all? His words echoed the very foundation of monarchy. Duty, sacrifice, loyalty. Without those, titles became hollow. Charles listened carefully, but those in the room knew William's influence was profound. He was not just the heir but the future, and Charles was acutely aware that his reign was transitional. William's perspective mattered because the monarchy would one day be his. To ignore William's voice would not only undermine his authority, but risk sowing division in the succession itself. Charles's dilemma was sharpened by this reality. To deny William now would be to jeopardize unity later. What complicated William's role was the memory of Diana. The brothers had once been united in their defense of her legacy, in their shared grief at her loss. Harry often invoked Diana when explaining his decisions to challenge the crown. He believed his mother would have supported him, would have stood by his defiance, would have embraced Meghan in the way the palace never did. William, however, saw it differently. He believed Diana's example called for restraint, dignity, and a sense of duty even in hardship. This difference in how they interpreted their mother's memory only deepened their divide. And in the meeting, though her name may not have been spoken, Diana's presence hung invisibly between them. The advisors who observed William noted how he framed his arguments not only for the present but for the future. He pointed out that if Harry's children were allowed to carry titles while living outside the monarchy, the same cycle of conflict could repeat itself. He stressed that clarity now would prevent greater turmoil later. For William, this was not merely about punishing his brother, but about setting a precedent that the monarchy could not be toyed with. It was, in his view, an act of protection for the institution he would one day inherit. Yet there was no mistaking the personal undercurrent in his words. Behind the firm reasoning lay years of frustration and disappointment. He had tried, at different points, to bring Harry back into the fold, but every effort ended in more distance. The Oprah interview had been a breaking point. The memoir had driven the knife deeper. By the time of the emergency meeting, William no longer believed reconciliation was possible. His role was not to save his brother, but to save the monarchy. That clarity gave his words power, but it also revealed the tragedy of the situation. The heir and the spare, once inseparable, now stood on opposite sides of a divide that might never be bridged. The reactions to William's stance were mixed, and agreed wholeheartedly, seeing in William the same steel that had defined their mother, Elizabeth II. Camilla, though sympathetic to Charles's pain, found William's reasoning unassailable. Advisors, too, saw in him the kind of decisiveness they craved from a future king. But Charles, listening in silence, felt the conflict more keenly. He recognized that William was right, but he also knew that siding with him meant choosing the crown over his youngest son. It was the same dilemma, but sharper now, because it was not only his burden, it was the legacy he would hand to William. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that William's role had been pivotal. His voice had steered the conversation away from hesitation and toward action. His influence had tipped the balance, convincing those still wavering that the monarchy could not survive half measures. Though Charles would be the one to speak the final decree, history would remember William as the one who gave it momentum. The chapter closes with William's gaze fixed firmly ahead, his expression resolute. He knew the decision would haunt the family, knew it would widen the chasm between him and Harry, knew it would invite public backlash. But for him, the cost was worth it. To protect the crown, he was willing to lose his brother. And that truth, though never spoken aloud, was the most devastating part of all. Princess and had always been the monarchy's most unyielding defender, a woman whose life was built on discipline, duty, and a refusal to indulge in sentimentality. Unlike her brothers, she never chased public approval or courted headlines. She simply worked, taking on engagement after engagement with an efficiency that earned her the nickname, the hardest-working royal. In the emergency meeting where Harry's future was being decided, it was Anne's presence that carried a quiet but undeniable weight. She did not need to raise her voice or deliver fiery speeches. Her authority came from something deeper, the memory of her mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and the role she now played as the custodian of that legacy. For Anne, the question of Harry's title was not about personal grievance or emotional conflict. It was about principle, about upholding the monarchy in the way her mother had for 70 years. She saw herself as the voice of continuity, the voice that reminded everyone in the room what the late Queen would have expected. And that expectation was clear: duty above all else. Elizabeth II had lived her entire life guided by the promise she made on her 21st birthday, that her whole life, whether long or short, would be devoted to service, and had inherited that philosophy, absorbed it, and carried it forward with a clarity few others could match. When Anne spoke during the meeting, the room grew still. Her words were not emotional, not clouded with hesitation. They were sharp, pragmatic, rooted in the values of the institution. Harry made his choice, she said plainly. He chose a life away from duty, and the monarchy cannot afford to pretend otherwise. Titles are not ornaments. They are responsibilities. If he will not carry them, then he cannot keep them. There was no malice in her tone, only conviction. It was the kind of logic that could not be easily argued against, because it carried the weight of history behind it. Her invocation of the Queen's memory was not overt, but it lingered in everything she said, and reminded the group that her mother had always believed in decisiveness. The Queen had endured many crises during her reign, scandals involving her children, public criticism after Diana's death, the controversies surrounding Andrew, and each time, she had acted with restraint but also with clarity when the moment demanded it, and argued that Harry's case was no different. The monarchy had to stand firm, even if it meant personal pain. That, she insisted, was the lesson Elizabeth had left them. What made Anne's role so influential was the contrast she provided to her brothers. Charles was torn, his emotions clouding his judgment. Andrew, when he was present in family discussions, had long since lost credibility due to his own scandals. Edward, though steady, did not command the same weight in matters of principle. William was strong, but his role was that of heir, his words inevitably framed by ambition as much as conviction. Anne, however, was different. She had no ambition for the throne, no scandals tied to her name, no need to protect her legacy. Her only loyalty was to the crown itself. That purity of motive gave her words a moral authority that no one else could match. As the debate continued and cut through the noise, when advisers fretted about public perception, she reminded them that the monarchy had weathered worse storms. When Camilla expressed concern about how Meghan would use the decision to further her narrative, and dismissed it with a shake of her head. The monarchy cannot be ruled by fear of what others will say, she told them. It must be ruled by what is right. Her focus was not on gossip or headlines, but on the survival of the institution her mother had dedicated her life to, and also understood better than anyone the danger of hesitation. She had seen her mother criticized during the days after Diana's death for appearing too slow to respond to public grief. That experience had left a mark on the family, and reminded Charles of that painful lesson. Delay breeds weakness. Action, however painful, breeds respect. People may not like the decision, she said, but they will respect it, and in time, they will see it was necessary. It was the kind of blunt truth Charles struggled to articulate himself, but could not deny when spoken by his sister. Her influence in the meeting went beyond her words. It was the aura she carried. The unspoken sense that she was channeling the Queen's voice, that if Elizabeth had been there, she would have said much the same. The others felt it too. Even William, who was firm in his stance, found his arguments sharpened by Anne's reinforcement. Camilla, though pragmatic in her own right, seemed steadied by Anne's confidence. And Charles, though burdened with doubt, could not help but hear his mother in Anne's tone, her sense of duty, her unwavering clarity. Yet, Anne was not blind to the personal pain involved. She loved her nephew, even if she disapproved of his choices. She had shared moments with him as a boy, watched him grow, seen flashes of Diana's spirit in his laughter and stubbornness. But for Anne, personal affection could not outweigh principle. She believed Harry had forfeited his place not because he fell in love with Meghan or because he sought independence, but because he used his position to attack the very institution that gave it meaning. To Anne, that was the line no royal could cross. Once crossed, the consequences were inevitable. Her stance left little room for compromise. Some in the room, though convinced of the need for action, still harbored hope that the decision could be softened, framed in a way that left a path open for reconciliation, and was not interested in such half measures. Reconciliation may come one day, she said, but it cannot come at the expense of the crown. The monarchy is not a negotiation. It is a duty. Her words silenced even the most cautious advisers. The message was clear. Sentiment might guide private hearts, but it could not dictate public duty. By the end of the meeting, Anne's role had become unmistakable. She had anchored the debate in principle, reminded the room of their late mother's example, and cut away the fog of emotion that clouded the discussion. If Charles had wavered and steadied him, if others hesitated and pushed them forward. She was the Queen's daughter, and in that moment, She was her mother's voice, speaking from beyond the grave to remind them all of what the crown demanded. The chapter closes with and sitting quietly, her hands still folded, her expression calm. She had said what needed to be said, and she knew her words would stay with her brother long after the meeting ended. History would not remember her speech, but it would remember the decision it helped shape. And in that decision, Anne's voice, echoing her mother's, would resonate forever. The decision to strip Harry of his title had barely settled within the palace walls before the outside world began to stir. For all the efforts at secrecy, for all the attempts to contain the matter as a private royal family crisis, the monarchy has never been able to fully shield itself from the press. One whisper, one leak, one stray word to the wrong person was all it took to set the engines of the global media ablaze. And once the story reached the public, it could no longer be contained. The first tremors came through hushed reports. A well-placed journalist known for his palace contacts posted a cryptic message hinting at an extraordinary royal decision. Within minutes, speculation rippled across social media. Was it about the king's health? Was it about William stepping up sooner than expected? Or was it, as some dared to suggest, the long-discussed question of Harry's titles? The lack of clarity only fed the frenzy. By the time the first headlines broke, the storm had already formed, and it was unlike anything the palace had seen in years. News outlets across Britain scrambled for confirmation. Some published unverified reports claiming Harry had already been informed. Others speculated Meghan was preparing a statement from California. Television studios broke into programming, anchors speaking in urgent tones, experts brought in to interpret every detail. The BBC, cautious as ever, waited for official confirmation but devoted hours of rolling coverage to the rumors. Tabloids were less restrained, splashing bold headlines across their digital front pages. Prince no more? Charles moves against Harry. The story had gone global before the palace even finalized its own announcement. Internationally, the reaction was immediate. American networks, long fascinated by Harry and Meghan's saga, treated it as breaking news. Commentators debated the fairness of the decision, some painting Harry as a victim of an outdated institution, others framing it as the inevitable consequence of his choices. In Australia, Canada, and across the Commonwealth, the story struck a nerve. For some, it was proof that the monarchy was clinging to power at all costs. For others, it was a reassuring sign of strength and clarity. Inside the palace, the communications team scrambled. They knew they had only hours, perhaps minutes, to seize control of the narrative. Drafts of statements were circulated, revised, and argued over. Every word mattered. Was Harry stripped of his title, or had it been removed? Was it framed as punishment, or as a necessary constitutional adjustment? Language was everything, because language would shape perception. Yet no matter how carefully the statement was crafted, the media storm was already beyond control. The press dissected not only the decision itself, but every implication. What did it mean for Harry's children? Would Archie and Lilibet retain their own titles? Or would they too be swept up in the king's decree? What did it say about Charles as a father? Was he a decisive monarch or a cold parent? What about William? Was he protecting the crown or pushing his brother further into exile? And Meghan, was she the silent instigator or the unfairly maligned outsider once again? Every angle was explored, every voice weighed in. Public relations experts offered competing takes. Some applauded the monarchy for showing strength in the face of relentless criticism. Others condemned it as short-sighted, predicting it would only make Harry more dangerous as a critic. Television panels filled with royal biographers, constitutional scholars, and celebrities speculating on the human cost of such a decision. The spectacle was total, consuming not only Britain but the world. And then came the social media firestorm. On platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, the decision became a trending topic within minutes. Hashtags exploded on both sides. Hashtag stand with Harry, hashtag crown first, hashtag end the monarchy, hashtag royal duty. Videos analyzing the decision garnered millions of views, memes flooded feeds, and ordinary people from every corner of the globe weighed in. The narrative fractured into countless interpretations, each one amplifying the noise. For the palace, it was a nightmare. They could control the wording of their official statement, but they could not control the digital wildfire consuming the world's attention. What made the media storm particularly dangerous was its unpredictability. In an age where perception often outweighs reality, the stripping of Harry's title was no longer just a decision. It was a global debate. Would it strengthen the monarchy's authority or accelerate its decline? Would it silence Harry or embolden him further? Would it garner sympathy for Charles or cast him as a villain in the eyes of the world? These questions swirled in real time, with no clear answers. The human element of the story fueled the frenzy even more. Commentators reminded audiences of the image of 12-year-old Harry walking behind Diana's coffin, the boy who had already endured so much loss. Was this decision yet another abandonment by his family? Others emphasized his own choices, pointing to his interviews, his memoir, his critiques of the monarchy. To them, this was not abandonment but accountability. The emotional contrast only deepened the storm, ensuring the story would not fade quickly. Within the palace, Charles and his advisors watched the coverage unfold with grim expressions. They had known there would be backlash, but the scale of it was sobering. For Charles, it was a reminder that his reign would never escape constant scrutiny, that every decision he made would be magnified beyond imagination. For William, it was a sign that the monarchy must hold its line, no matter the noise. For Anne, it was confirmation of what she had argued all along, that sentiment should never dictate duty. The storm showed no signs of calming. Each hour brought new reactions, new interpretations, new angles. Celebrities weighed in, politicians offered opinions, even foreign leaders were asked to comment. What had begun as an internal decision had become an international event, one that threatened to overshadow everything else on the royal agenda. The coronation plans, the king's state visits, the quiet work of other royals, all of it was eclipsed by the single story of a father stripping his son of his title. The chapter closes with that image, the monarchy standing firm inside the palace walls while outside, the world raged with debate, speculation, and judgment. The media storm had begun, and it would not pass quickly. The monarchy had made its choice, but now it would have to weather the consequences, not only in history books, but in the unrelenting court of public opinion. The decision to strip Harry of his title did not remain confined to headlines or expert analysis. It rippled outward into the hearts and minds of ordinary people, sparking emotional reactions that revealed just how divided the world had become over the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. On the streets of London, in cafes in California, across the Commonwealth, and even in places where the monarchy was little more than a symbol on coins or stamps, the news touched nerves. Some saw justice, others saw cruelty, and together, these opposing voices created a public uproar that rivaled even the media storm itself. In Britain, the reactions were immediate and visceral. Outside Buckingham Palace, where tourists usually gathered for photos, reporters now lingered to capture the voices of citizens who had strong opinions to share. Some Londoners spoke with relief. "About time," said one middle-aged man, his voice sharp with disapproval for Harry's years of criticism. "You can't have it both ways, being royal when it suits you, then tearing the family apart on American television. The king did what he had to." Such sentiments were echoed in pubs, offices, and even Parliament, where a handful of commentators suggested the decision restored credibility to the monarchy. Yet across the same city, others spoke with sadness and anger. Outside Kensington Gardens, a group of young women held up signs reading, "We stand with Harry," and "Love over duty." They argued that stripping him of his title was nothing less than punishment for choosing his wife and mental health over tradition. He lost his mother young, and now he's lost his title because he wanted a different life? "It's cruel," one said tearfully, a view that resonated with younger generations who saw Harry not as a traitor but as a symbol of resistance against outdated systems. The backlash extended beyond Britain's borders. In the United States, Harry and Meghan's adopted home, the decision was largely framed as a punishment fueled by jealousy and rigidity. American talk shows dissected the news with a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Audiences applauded Harry for escaping what they saw as an archaic institution, and commentators painted Charles as cold and unfeeling, a man prioritizing a crown over his son. On social media, Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Harry and hashtag End the Monarchy trended for hours, fueled by celebrities who spoke out in his defense. For American audiences, Harry and Meghan had long been embraced as modern, relatable figures. Stripping him of his title only deepened that narrative of victimhood. Across the Commonwealth, the response was more complex. In Canada and Australia, countries with their own debates about whether to maintain ties to the monarchy, the decision reignited calls for republicanism. Politicians and activists argued that if the monarchy could discard one of its own so ruthlessly, what loyalty did it deserve from nations half a world away? In the Caribbean, where resentment toward colonial legacies already simmered, the move was seen by some as confirmation that the monarchy was incapable of compassion or inclusivity. The decision, intended to protect the institution, risked alienating the very nations that gave it relevance. But sympathy was not universal. For many in Britain, particularly among older generations, Harry's behavior had crossed too many lines. They saw the stripping of his title not as cruelty, but as accountability. If he wanted to leave, fine. But don't bite the hand that feeds you and still expect the perks, said a retiree interviewed outside Windsor. In this view, Harry had betrayed not only his family but the public trust, and Charles's decision was a necessary act of discipline. This generational divide became stark, with older voices applauding the king's firmness while younger ones mourned the fracture. What made the backlash so intense was the emotional history tied to Harry himself. People remembered the boy walking behind Diana's coffin, the soldier who served on the front lines, the prince who had once been the nation's cheeky favorite. To many, stripping him of his title felt like stripping away the last link to Diana, as if her legacy were being diminished along with her son. Supporters of Harry often invoked her memory, arguing that she, too, had been cast aside by the institution for refusing to conform. In their eyes, history was repeating itself, and Harry was paying the price for following in his mother's footsteps. Sympathy for Charles existed too, though quieter. Some acknowledged the impossible bind he was in, choosing between protecting his reign and protecting his son. It must be the hardest thing, being king and father at the same time, one woman admitted during a BBC call-in show. Whatever he did, people would have hated him for it. These voices recognized the tragedy on both sides, seeing not only a monarchy struggling to survive, but a family collapsing under its own weight. The backlash was also fueled by the relentless machinery of social media. Images of Harry as a young boy beside his mother were shared alongside headlines announcing the loss of his title, creating a narrative of abandonment and betrayal. Others circulated clips of Harry's past interviews where he spoke about wanting to protect his wife and children, framing the decision as a punishment for love. On the other side, memes mocking him for complaining while living in luxury went viral, portraying him as ungrateful. The digital debate was ruthless, amplifying extremes and drowning out nuance. Protests, though small, began to surface in different parts of the world. Outside the British consulate in New York, a handful of demonstrators carried placards calling the monarchy heartless. In London, monarchist groups organized counter-rallies, waving Union Jacks and chanting slogans about loyalty and tradition. The divide was not just ideological, it was generational, cultural, and deeply emotional. The monarchy had once been seen as a unifying force, but this decision revealed just how fractured public opinion had become. For the palace, the backlash was both expected and unsettling. Advisors had prepared for criticism, but the sheer scale of emotional reaction was difficult to manage. The monarchy thrives on control, on measured responses, and quiet strength. The rawness of public anger, sympathy, and debate made control almost impossible. Every statement the palace released was dissected, every word interpreted as either too cold or too defensive. In a world where perception often matters more than truth, the backlash became as dangerous as the decision itself. The chapter closes with a picture of a divided public, some cheering the monarchy for standing firm, others mourning a son cast out by his father, and millions more caught somewhere in between, unsure what to believe but unable to look away. The decision to strip Harry of his title had been made within the walls of Buckingham Palace, but its consequences now belong to the world. And in that world, sympathy and backlash swirled together in a storm that showed no sign of quieting. The news of Harry being stripped of his title spread across the world like wildfire, but no one felt it sting more deeply than Harry himself. Thousands of miles away in California, the announcement reached him not through a private phone call from his father, but through headlines flashing across news outlets and push notifications pinging on phones. For Harry, it was a familiar wound reopened. The monarchy choosing the institution over the individual, his family over his freedom. And as the world speculated about how he would respond, he and Meghan began preparing their countermove. Harry's first reaction, insiders close to the couple suggested, was disbelief mixed with anger. Though he had long anticipated that the monarchy might one day take this step, the reality of it hit differently. He had been born a prince, his identity woven into the title since birth. To have it stripped away by his father's decree was to feel severed not only from the institution, but from his own history. It was a finality that no memoir, no interview, no declaration of independence could prepare him for. Meghan, standing by him, reportedly urged calm, but was equally furious, interpreting the decision as an attack not just on Harry but on their family as a whole. The couple quickly recognized that silence would not serve them. The monarchy's announcement, no matter how carefully worded, cast the decision as a matter of duty and principle. Left unchecked, that narrative would dominate. Harry and Meghan knew they had to seize control of their story, to frame the decision not as an act of justice, but as an act of cruelty. Their countermove began with strategy meetings with their media advisors, legal consultants, and closest allies. Every option was on the table: interviews, documentaries, lawsuits, even public speeches. The question was not whether to respond, but how. The first countermove came through carefully placed leaks. Sources close to Harry and Meghan began briefing sympathetic journalists, painting the decision as vindictive and unjust. Stories emerged suggesting Harry had not been informed in advance, that he had been blindsided by the news, and that the monarchy had chosen to humiliate him publicly. These reports stoked sympathy, particularly in the United States, where the narrative of Harry as a victim of a cold, outdated institution resonated strongly. Next came the question of an official statement. Meghan was cautious. She knew that every word would be dissected, twisted, and used against them. But Harry felt compelled to speak. His instinct was to defend his choices, to frame the loss of his title not as a punishment, but as proof of his independence. "They can take the title," he was overheard telling a confidant, "but they can't take who I am." This became the backbone of the couple's strategy, to shift the narrative from one of loss to one of liberation. Behind the scenes, legal teams also explored options. Could the decision be challenged? Was there any precedent for reinstating a title once removed? Though the legal path was murky, the very suggestion of a lawsuit carried power. It signaled defiance, a refusal to accept the monarchy's authority unchallenged. Even if the case never made it to court, the threat alone ensured the story would remain in headlines for weeks. Meghan's role in the countermove was both strategic and symbolic. She understood the optics of the situation better than anyone. For years, she had been cast as the outsider, the scapegoat for Harry's estrangement. Now, she framed herself not as the instigator but as the supporter, standing beside her husband as he endured yet another rejection from his family. In interviews she gave around that time, she avoided directly attacking the monarchy, but spoke passionately about resilience, family, and the importance of building one's own legacy. The subtext was clear: they did not need the crown to define them. At the same time, the couple began planning their next big media appearance. Rumors swirled that they were in talks with a major network for a tell-all interview, one that would not only address the loss of Harry's title, but also reveal new details about the inner workings of the palace. If true, this would be their most explosive countermove yet, ensuring that their voices would not be drowned out by official statements from Buckingham Palace. The world waited with bated breath, wondering what bombshells might drop next. Publicly, the countermove worked to some extent. Sympathy for Harry swelled in certain circles, particularly among younger generations and international audiences. Social media was filled with messages of support, fans insisting that Harry did not need a title to prove his worth. Influential voices echoed the sentiment, framing him as a man punished for choosing love over duty. Yet backlash persisted too. Critics argued that Harry and Meghan were exploiting their situation for attention, that their countermove was less about defending dignity and more about fueling their brand. The divide grew sharper, the noise louder. For Harry, the countermove was not only about optics, but about survival. Stripped of his title, he felt an urgent need to redefine himself, to prove that he was more than the institution that had cast him aside. For Meghan, it was an opportunity to reframe their story on their terms, to ensure history would not remember Harry as a discarded prince, but as a man who chose a different path. Together, their countermove was not just about responding to the decision. It was about reclaiming their identity. The chapter ends with Harry and Meghan sitting together late at night in their Montecito home, the glow of news coverage still flickering on screens around them. Outside, the California night was quiet, a world away from the storm raging across Britain. But inside, their minds were alive with strategy, with anger, with determination. The monarchy had struck its blow, but they would not remain silent. Their countermove had begun, and its impact would reverberate as loudly as the decision itself. The palace was thrown into a storm of internal tension immediately after the announcement that Harry had been stripped of his title. While the public saw a formal statement emphasizing duty and tradition, the corridors of Buckingham Palace were alive with whispers, urgent meetings, and palpable unease. For decades, the royal family had been careful to present a united front, to manage crises with carefully measured responses. But this decision, unlike any other, cut deep into personal relationships, shaking not only the institution but the very bonds that had held the family together. King Charles, the orchestrator of the decision, reportedly convened an emergency council with his closest advisors, senior members of the royal household, and legal experts. Sources inside the palace described the scene as tense, almost electric, with each person acutely aware that the ramifications of the move would ripple far beyond the walls of the estate. Some advisors argued that the decision was necessary to preserve the monarchy's integrity, to show that titles were privileges contingent upon adherence to royal expectations. Others warned that the backlash could be severe, that Harry's supporters both in the UK and abroad would interpret the move as punitive and personal. Queen Camilla, while publicly supportive of Charles's decision, reportedly felt conflicted behind closed doors. The Queen Consort had long maintained a delicate balance between her loyalty to the king and her awareness of the public's perception of the family. Stripping Harry of his title, though framed as a matter of principle, was a deeply personal action, and those close to Camilla suggested that she struggled with the emotional implications. Would this widen the gap between the monarchy and a segment of the public who still admired Harry? Would the move embolden critics who viewed the royal family as unyielding or even cruel? Princess, and often regarded as one of the most straightforward and pragmatic members of the family, was said to have taken a surprisingly sympathetic stance. Although she did not oppose the decision outright, she reportedly cautioned against underestimating Harry's response. "You cannot erase him from public consciousness," she was quoted saying to senior aides. "He will find his voice, and when he does, it will be heard around the world." Her words carried weight, for Anne's reputation as a no-nonsense royal lent credibility to her concerns. She understood that Harry, unlike some family members, had a global platform and would not disappear quietly. Meanwhile, other younger members of the royal family reacted with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and, in some cases, relief. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, for instance, were reportedly frustrated by the timing of the decision and the media circus that ensued. While they may have understood the rationale behind the move, the suddenness of it created tension within their own circles, particularly as they were still navigating their roles in a rapidly evolving monarchy. Insiders suggested that William and Catherine worried about the public narrative, the perception that the family was fracturing at a critical moment, and the long-term impact on the monarchy's image. The media reaction added another layer of complexity. British tabloids, ever vigilant for scandal, seized on every nuance of the palace's response. Headlines ranged from measured analyses of institutional necessity to sensationalist portrayals of familial betrayal. Across social media, the story exploded, with hashtags, commentary, and speculation flooding timelines around the globe. Every gesture, every private word from palace insiders, and every subtle glance caught on camera was scrutinized, interpreted, and often distorted to fit pre-existing narratives. For the family, this was not merely about managing an internal crisis. It was about managing perception on an unprecedented scale. Experts in royal affairs weighed in almost immediately. Some argued that the decision was a necessary act of discipline, emphasizing the importance of hierarchy and responsibility in maintaining a centuries-old institution. Others criticized it as short-sighted, noting that Harry had consistently demonstrated a willingness to navigate the line between duty and personal freedom. Removing his title, they argued, risked alienating both the public and the international audience that had followed Harry's journey with intense interest. Analysts pointed out that the monarchy's authority rested not only on tradition but also on public approval, and this move, if mishandled, could erode the latter in ways that would reverberate for years. Within the palace, discussions turned to damage control. Senior aides debated whether to issue additional statements, offer private reconciliation, or maintain silence in the hope that the controversy would fade. Some argued for proactive engagement, suggesting that a carefully crafted message emphasizing Harry's continuing role in charitable endeavors might soften the blow. Others contended that any response could be perceived as weakness, undermining the authority of the king's decision. The debate reflected the tension between strategy and emotion, between the preservation of institution and the management of familial bonds. Amid this turmoil, whispers of personal confrontations began circulating. Though much remained unverified, sources suggested that several family members sought private meetings with Harry and Meghan to discuss the decision. The goal, ostensibly, was to de-escalate the situation and prevent further public fallout. However, the atmosphere was described as fraught, with emotions running high and trust strained to the breaking point. Every word, every gesture, carried weight, for the family understood that Harry's reaction would shape the global perception of the monarchy for months, if not years, to come. By the end of the first 48 hours, the palace had settled into a tense, almost fragile rhythm. Security was heightened not only for practical reasons, but also because of the attention the story had drawn. Advisors continued to brief the king on media coverage, public sentiment, and potential legal implications. At the same time, the family privately grappled with the human element of the decision, the impact on relationships, the emotional toll of public scrutiny, and the knowledge that once a title was stripped, reconciliation would be more complicated than ever. As Harry and Meghan prepared their countermove, the royal family's internal dynamics shifted dramatically. What had been an orderly institution operating on tradition and precedent became, in many ways, a battlefield of loyalties, strategies, and emotions. Every conversation, every decision, every statement carried consequences far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. The world watched closely, captivated by the unfolding drama, while inside, the family faced the daunting challenge of balancing authority with humanity, duty with empathy, and tradition with the unpredictable forces of personal ambition and global attention. The world waited with bated breath for Prince Harry's response. Within hours of King Charles's unprecedented announcement stripping him of his royal title, sources close to Harry revealed that he was in a state of shock and profound disbelief. For decades, Harry had been trained, nurtured, and molded within the royal institution. His titles were not merely ceremonial. They were symbols of his identity, his legacy, and his place within a family he had both adored and, at times, rebelled against. To have them revoked so abruptly, and in a manner that became a global headline within minutes, was more than a personal affront. It was a seismic shock that reverberated across the monarchy and the public alike. Inside Harry's private residence, Meghan Markle reportedly played a central role in helping him process the news. Friends of the couple described a scene of intense emotional vulnerability, with Harry pacing and repeating fragments of disbelief, while Meghan, ever the strategist, urged calm and careful deliberation. She reportedly reminded him that the world was watching, that every action and statement would be analyzed, dissected, and weaponized by the media and public opinion. Yet, beneath the measured public persona, there was raw emotion, anger, hurt, and an almost tangible sense of betrayal. Sources noted that Harry's sense of identity had been so intertwined with his title that losing it felt akin to losing a part of himself. The decision to release a public statement was deliberate and calculated. Harry and Meghan's communications team, long experienced in managing global media attention, drafted messages that balanced dignity with emotional transparency. The statement was succinct, yet deeply poignant. Harry expressed regret over any perceived disruption caused by the removal of his title, reaffirmed his commitment to public service, and underscored his dedication to his family. But beneath the surface, there were unmistakable undertones of disappointment and a clear indication that this was not the end of his response. Analysts and commentators immediately pored over the wording, highlighting phrases that suggested both resilience and simmering resentment. Media outlets around the world dissected the statement, each framing it to suit their narrative. In the United Kingdom, tabloids emphasized the tension between father and son, framing Harry's reaction as emotional yet restrained, portraying him as a dutiful son grappling with a profound personal loss. In the United States, commentators interpreted the statement through the lens of personal freedom and independence, painting Harry as a modern prince navigating the complexities of tradition, identity, and media scrutiny. Social media exploded, with hashtags trending across platforms as millions debated the implications, shared opinions, and speculated about the next steps in a saga that had already captivated the globe. Behind the scenes, the royal family's communications team monitored the fallout meticulously. Every media outlet, every social media post, every public reaction was logged, analyzed, and assessed for potential impact on public sentiment and institutional stability. Advisors debated whether to respond, remain silent, or attempt to engage in a controlled dialogue with Harry and Meghan. The goal was to maintain the appearance of unity while subtly reinforcing the necessity and legitimacy of the king's decision. Yet, even the most experienced strategists acknowledged that this was a delicate balancing act. One wrong move could escalate the situation and invite further scrutiny, criticism, or international controversy. Harry's inner circle, including close friends, aides, and confidants, offered a mix of counsel, support, and strategic advice. Some urged him to remain silent and allow the initial shock to settle, warning that public statements could be manipulated or misinterpreted. Others encouraged a more assertive approach, suggesting that Harry had the platform and credibility to articulate his perspective boldly, to challenge narratives that might paint him as weak, disloyal, or overly emotional. The debate highlighted a critical tension, the need to protect personal dignity while navigating a complex, highly publicized family dispute that had implications far beyond personal relationships. Meanwhile, Meghan's role in shaping the response became increasingly evident. Sources indicated that she had long advised Harry on how to manage media attention, public perception, and messaging strategy. In this moment of crisis, her guidance was both practical and emotional, helping Harry balance the need for transparency with the necessity of restraint. She reportedly emphasized the importance of focusing on core values, family, public service, and personal integrity, while avoiding statements that could exacerbate the rift or create additional controversies. Yet, Meghan's presence and influence were also scrutinized, with critics suggesting that she had a hand in shaping Harry's messaging in a manner that challenged the monarchy's narrative. As the hours passed, Harry began preparing for a series of public appearances and interviews designed to address the situation. Advisors crafted careful talking points, emphasizing themes of service, duty, and emotional honesty, while deliberately avoiding overt criticism of the king or the royal family. Yet, within these carefully constructed statements, there were hints of deeper truths, subtle indications that Harry's loyalty to the institution was being tested, that personal hurt and institutional loyalty were in conflict. Observers noted the delicate balance he attempted to maintain, assert his independence, protect his family, and uphold his commitment to public service, all while navigating a situation charged with emotion, history, and global attention. Public opinion quickly became polarized. Supporters of Harry lauded his courage and resilience, praising him for maintaining dignity in the face of a deeply personal loss. Critics argued that his response was calculated, overly curated, or even self-serving, suggesting that Harry had long prepared for a moment in which he would assert independence from the monarchy. Social commentators debated whether the removal of his title was justified, whether Harry's response reflected emotional maturity or strategic media management, and how this conflict might influence the future of the royal family as an institution. Even within the broader network of international royalty and global institutions, Harry's response was closely observed. Allies and observers noted the unprecedented nature of the situation, recognizing that stripping a prince of his title was a historically rare and institutionally significant action. Harry's carefully measured public reaction, juxtaposed with the raw emotional undercurrents described by insiders, painted a portrait of a man navigating extraordinary pressure, public scrutiny, and familial complexity. The global lens through which his statements were viewed amplified both their significance and their potential consequences. By the end of the first week following the announcement, Harry's response had solidified into a narrative of resilience, dignity, and cautious assertiveness. He maintained public appearances, continued charitable engagements, and subtly communicated his commitment to family and public service. At the same time, private discussions within his inner circle and between Harry and Meghan suggested ongoing deliberation regarding long-term strategy, potential reconciliations, and the management of global perception. Every action, every word, and every gesture was weighted with significance, both personally and institutionally. Harry's public statement and initial response thus marked a pivotal chapter in this unfolding saga. It demonstrated not only the emotional impact of the king's unprecedented decision, but also Harry's ability to navigate a deeply personal crisis under global scrutiny. The carefully balanced blend of transparency, dignity, and subtle defiance set the stage for the next phase of this story, a confrontation of narratives, a redefinition of identity, and an ongoing struggle between personal autonomy and institutional expectation. Almost immediately after King Charles's announcement, the media landscape exploded in a frenzy. News outlets across continents scrambled to cover the story, each trying to secure exclusives, insider leaks, and commentary that would capture the public's attention. Within minutes, headlines flashed across screens. Prince Harry stripped of title, royal crisis unfolds, monarchy in turmoil. Social media, too, became a storm of opinions, memes, and viral commentary, with hashtags trending in multiple languages as millions of people expressed shock, outrage, or approval. The pace of dissemination was unprecedented, making it nearly impossible for any single narrative to dominate the conversation. In the United Kingdom, tabloids sensationalized every detail. The Daily Mail ran an extensive analysis of Harry's upbringing, his public missteps, and historical instances where the monarchy had exercised authority in unprecedented ways. The Sun speculated on potential repercussions within the family, including rifts between William and Harry, while the Telegraph focused on constitutional implications, debating whether stripping a prince of his title set a new precedent for royal authority. Each story was crafted not just to inform, but to provoke emotional engagement, driving conversation in public forums and drawing millions of readers eager to witness the unfolding drama. Across the Atlantic, American media framed the story with a different lens. Outlets emphasized themes of independence, personal freedom, and defiance against tradition. Harry's carefully worded public statement was dissected for subtext, with commentators suggesting that his response reflected a strategic effort to maintain public support while navigating an emotionally charged family conflict. Analysts debated whether Harry's international popularity could serve as leverage, potentially influencing perceptions of the monarchy globally. Talk shows, online publications, and news segments amplified the narrative, connecting the royal crisis to broader discussions about institutional authority, celebrity influence, and media power. Social media platforms were a theater of divided opinions. Millions of users expressed solidarity with Harry, highlighting perceived injustices, questioning the fairness of the king's decision, and praising Harry's composed public response. Others criticized him for what they perceived as arrogance, entitlement, or attempts to manipulate public sentiment. Influencers, celebrities, and commentators weighed in, sharing personal interpretations and fueling further engagement. Viral clips, memes, and GIFs illustrated both the humor and the gravity of the situation, demonstrating how modern communication channels could amplify controversy in real time. International royal observers and experts also weighed in. Biographers, historians, and constitutional scholars analyzed the legal and traditional significance of stripping a prince of his title. Many noted the rarity of such an action, emphasizing that it went beyond mere symbolism. It was a statement of authority, control, and prioritization of institutional stability over personal loyalty. Analysts debated how this move might influence future generations of the royal family, questioning whether it marked a turning point in the relationship between the monarchy and its members or whether it was an isolated, reactive decision. Within the royal family itself, reactions were more guarded. Sources suggested that some senior members were stunned, struggling to reconcile their respect for the king with concern for Harry's emotional well-being. Private conversations reportedly focused on damage control, both internally and in public perception. Advisors discussed how to manage the fallout, preparing statements that emphasized the king's authority while attempting to avoid alienating public sentiment. Even minor gestures, such as travel schedules, appearances, and ceremonial roles, were scrutinized for symbolic meaning, revealing the extent to which optics governed the family's actions. Public sentiment, too, was fractured. Polling data indicated sharp divides across demographics. Support for Harry remained strong among younger generations, urban populations, and international observers, who interpreted the event as an injustice rooted in tradition, privilege, or interpersonal conflict. Conversely, older generations and traditionalists largely supported the king, viewing the decision as a necessary assertion of authority designed to maintain the dignity and structure of the monarchy. Commentators highlighted the cultural dimensions of this divide, noting how social identity, historical perspective, and media framing all influenced interpretation and emotional response. As the hours and days passed, the story evolved into a multi-layered spectacle. Every movement by Harry, every statement by the palace, and every media report added a new dimension to the narrative. Conspiracy theories emerged, speculating on hidden motivations, political pressures, and potential behind-the-scenes negotiations. Analysts debated whether the king's action was purely personal, a calculated institutional decision, or influenced by public opinion and media perception. Each layer of analysis fueled further interest, sustaining the story's momentum and ensuring it remained a central focus of global conversation. Royal commentators also noted the broader historical context. Instances of title revocation, familial estrangement, and public shaming in monarchies around the world were compared to Harry's situation. These historical precedents provided perspective, highlighting both the rarity and the severity of King Charles's decision. Commentators emphasized that this was not merely a personal dispute. It was a defining moment in the monarchy's ongoing evolution, one that would shape public perception, familial dynamics, and institutional authority for years to come. Beyond strategy, Harry's inner turmoil was palpable. Close family confidants described private conversations filled with raw emotion. He grappled with a sense of betrayal, feeling that decisions affecting his identity had been made without consultation or opportunity for dialogue. These feelings were compounded by the realization that the event would redefine him in the eyes of the world, creating a narrative that could potentially overshadow decades of charitable work, personal struggles, and efforts to forge a distinct identity apart from royal expectation. Harry's challenge was not only to process his own emotions, but to anticipate how they would be interpreted, misrepresented, or weaponized in a public arena increasingly driven by sensational headlines and viral speculation. Psychologists and mental health experts weighed in on the potential impact. Public stripping of status, particularly for someone so closely tied to personal identity and public duty, can generate profound psychological stress. Experts noted that feelings of rejection, isolation, and diminished self-worth often accompany such public censure. However, they also emphasized that coping strategies, strong social support, and continued engagement in purposeful work can mitigate long-term harm. For Harry, these insights were more than academic. They shaped how his inner circle structured private support systems, providing both emotional counseling and practical advice on navigating the cascading media attention. In parallel, Harry's communications team considered the optics of any public response. Historically, he had maintained a careful balance between transparency and discretion, often choosing to speak candidly about personal struggles only when he could frame them in a constructive context. With the stripping of his title, every word, gesture, and appearance risked being interpreted as either defiance, submission, or betrayal. Advisors debated whether silence would protect him, whether a formal statement expressing measured disappointment would suffice, or whether strategic engagement through interviews and charitable events could reassert his narrative on his own terms. Emotionally, Harry's internal dialogue reflected a struggle between attachment and autonomy. As a son, grandson, and brother, he felt the weight of familial bonds, connections that had once defined his identity and sense of belonging. Yet the decision by King Charles forced him to confront a stark reality. Personal ties could be subordinated to institutional imperatives. This tension between personal loyalty and the immutable structures of monarchy created a psychological crucible in which Harry had to navigate complex questions of self-worth, identity, and legacy. Each decision, even in private moments, carried symbolic weight, magnified by the inevitable public gaze. In the hours that followed, small but significant actions indicated Harry's initial coping mechanisms. Observers noted that he continued scheduled charitable engagements via remote communication, maintaining visible involvement in causes deeply meaningful to him. Family aides observed his meticulous attention to ongoing projects, as though asserting continuity and stability in a life suddenly punctuated by upheaval. This behavior illustrated a profound understanding. Even stripped of formal title, identity and purpose could still be preserved through action, empathy, and continued engagement with the world. Yet beneath the surface, tension lingered. Harry's relationship with the broader royal family became a subject of intense speculation. Would he respond with public statements, legal measures, or private reconciliation attempts? Sources close to the palace suggested that King Charles anticipated a range of responses, and that contingency planning had begun on both sides. Meanwhile, media outlets framed every possible scenario as a high-stakes drama, analyzing historical parallels, speculating on secret communications, and projecting future conflict trajectories. Every speculation, no matter how minor, intensified the psychological pressure and heightened public anticipation. By the end of the first 24 hours, Harry's situation epitomized the intersection of personal loss, public scrutiny, and institutional authority. Stripped of his title, facing a global audience, and navigating intense emotional turmoil, he confronted not only the personal consequences of King Charles's decision, but also the broader implications for his public identity, familial bonds, and long-term legacy. In many ways, this chapter of his life became a crucible, testing his resilience, strategic thinking, and emotional fortitude against a backdrop of unprecedented public attention and historical consequence. The palace was abuzz with tension unlike any seen in recent decades. An emergency meeting convened at Buckingham Palace had thrown the usually orchestrated routines of the royal household into disarray. Key aides, senior staff, and trusted advisors assembled in the gilded halls, their faces etched with concern, uncertainty, and a sense of urgency. The decision by King Charles to strip Prince Harry of his prince title had not only shocked the public, but also created ripples of confusion and speculation within the very corridors of power that were meant to manage such events. Whispers of disagreement, speculation, and fear of public backlash floated through the rooms, a stark contrast to the calm composure typically cultivated in royal circles. Behind the ornate doors of the council chamber, a cascade of hurried discussions unfolded. Senior officials debated the timing, wording, and potential fallout of the announcement. Some feared that the action might appear hasty or reactionary, sparking international scrutiny and domestic dissent. Others argued that decisive action was necessary to assert the authority of the monarchy and maintain the integrity of royal titles. This internal debate revealed the delicate balance between tradition, personal loyalty, and modern media pressures. Advisors knew that every misstep could lead to a cascade of negative headlines, further complicating an already fraught situation. Palace staff described an atmosphere heavy with tension and anxiety. Every phone call, message, and email seemed urgent, carrying the weight of global attention. Secretaries rushed to prepare press releases, ensuring that every statement adhered to strict protocols. Meanwhile, private aides monitored social media and news outlets, anticipating the inevitable public reactions that would range from outrage and sympathy to judgment and mockery. The royal household, long trained in the art of discretion, suddenly faced a crisis that demanded both speed and precision, while navigating a media landscape that was far less forgiving than the quiet corridors of Buckingham had ever been. Amid this organized chaos, King Charles convened a smaller, more private session with senior family members and trusted confidants. His tone was reported to be firm yet measured, a reflection of the immense weight of the decision. Statements from palace insiders suggest that Charles emphasized the necessity of preserving the integrity of the monarchy while acknowledging the personal ramifications for Harry. He reportedly spoke of the tension between familial affection and institutional duty, underscoring the difficult path that led to this unprecedented action. For the family, this was more than a political decision. It was a personal reckoning with loyalty, reputation, and the burdens of public life. The Queen Consort, Camilla, was also reportedly involved in discussions, her presence both symbolic and practical. As a senior member of the royal family, her insights were sought on how the decision might be framed to the public and how the household could navigate potential backlash. Observers noted her calm demeanor, though insiders hinted at a quiet concern for the emotional well-being of her stepson. Every gesture, expression, and word within these meetings was carefully weighed, reflecting the delicate interplay of power, family dynamics, and public perception. In the background, staff members prepared contingency plans. Scenarios ranged from media storms to public protests, all requiring precise coordination and rapid responses. Security personnel were briefed on potential escalations, while communications teams strategized about controlling the narrative without appearing defensive. Historical precedents were examined, lessons from past royal controversies revisited, and expert advisors consulted to anticipate every possible outcome. Within the palace, the machinery of monarchy was running at full throttle, yet the emotional and human stakes of the decision loomed over every action. Beyond the formal halls, whispers of dissent and concern extended to the wider royal network. Princes, princesses, and extended family members reportedly engaged in private conversations about loyalty, responsibility, and the potential consequences of King Charles's decision. Some expressed empathy for Harry, understanding the personal pain involved, while others debated the necessity of maintaining institutional authority above personal relationships. These behind-the-scenes discussions highlighted the complex dynamics that govern the royal family, where personal emotions and public duty are inextricably intertwined, creating a web of tension and intrigue that extends far beyond official statements. As the day progressed, the royal household also had to contend with the immediacy of global media coverage. News outlets were poised to broadcast every detail, speculate on motives, and dissect reactions. Social media platforms erupted with commentary, analysis, and conjecture, forcing palace officials to adapt quickly. Real-time monitoring of public sentiment became crucial, as the household sought to control both the narrative and the perception of legitimacy surrounding the decision. Every statement, photograph, and carefully curated gesture was scrutinized under the relentless gaze of a public eager for insight into the private turmoil of one of the world's most famous families. Throughout this whirlwind, the underlying emotional current remained potent. Palace insiders described a sense of collective unease, a recognition that the royal family had entered uncharted territory. For many staff members, the decision represented not only a professional challenge but a deeply personal one. They were witnesses to history, mediators in a family drama that would define public perception for years to come. The human cost of the decision, strained relationships, public judgment, and the emotional burden on all involved was palpable in every hurried conversation, in every anxious glance, and in the hushed tones that replaced the usual protocol-driven clarity. As evening fell over the palace, the magnitude of the situation began to crystallize. Preparations for public statements were finalized, contingency plans reviewed, and security measures tightened. Yet beneath the structured response, an unmistakable tension lingered. A recognition that the events of this day would have lasting implications, not only for Prince Harry and the immediate family, but for the monarchy itself. The royal household had been thrust into a crucible of historical significance, its every move under scrutiny, its every action capable of shaping the narrative for generations. The strain, complexity, and emotional weight of this unprecedented decision were now the defining features of the palace's existence. When the news of King Charles's decision reached Prince Harry, it reportedly struck him like a thunderclap. According to sources close to him, the moment was raw, personal, and charged with a mix of disbelief, anger, and deep sorrow. The prince, long accustomed to balancing public scrutiny with private life, found himself in a situation that transcended any previous challenge. Stripped of his title in an emergency move that shocked the world, he faced not only the loss of a formal recognition but the weight of what the act symbolized, a fracture in the relationship with his father and a clear message about the boundaries of royal authority. Inside Harry's private residence, the atmosphere was tense. Close aides described the scene as one filled with quiet chaos, a stark contrast to the polished calm often associated with royal appearances. Phones rang incessantly, messages and emails piled up, and trusted confidants moved in and out, trying to manage both the logistics and the emotional fallout. Harry himself reportedly spent hours in contemplation, wrestling with a complex mix of emotions. There was anger at the perceived betrayal, confusion about the timing, and an underlying sadness at the perceived rejection from his own family. The personal nature of this decision struck harder than any public criticism could, and the emotional weight was visible in every aspect of his demeanor. Reports indicate that Harry reached out immediately to his closest advisors, seeking guidance, reassurance, and a path forward. Conversations ranged from legal counsel on the implications of the title removal to strategies for managing public perception and media response. Every detail mattered: how to frame his reaction publicly without seeming vindictive, how to reassure his supporters and the broader public, and how to maintain dignity while navigating what many insiders described as an unprecedented personal and professional upheaval. The careful balancing act between personal feelings and public duty became an immediate and pressing concern, consuming hours of deliberation and introspection. Harry's private reaction was also shaped by the broader context of his life in recent years. Having stepped back from full-time royal duties, he had already navigated tensions with both the institution and the media. Yet this development represented a stark escalation, turning ongoing friction into a formal, irreversible act by the monarch. Sources suggest that Harry felt a profound sense of betrayal, not simply for the loss of title, but for the symbolic message it conveyed, that familial loyalty was being subordinated to institutional authority. The emotional impact was reportedly compounded by the suddenness and public visibility of the decision, leaving him with little time to process or prepare for the consequences. Friends and confidants describe Harry as oscillating between moments of composure and intense emotion. He reportedly sought solace in private conversations, reaching out to Meghan Markle and other close family members for support and perspective. The Duchess of Sussex, understanding the magnitude of the situation, reportedly counseled patience, strategic thinking, and a focus on long-term well-being. Their conversations highlighted the dual pressures of public life and private loyalty, emphasizing the need to maintain unity, protect the children, and navigate the fallout without allowing emotion to dictate actions that could exacerbate the situation. The prince's reaction also had a physical dimension. Sources describe him pacing in private quarters, revisiting messages, rereading communications from the royal household, and attempting to reconcile his feelings with the reality of the decision. Sleep reportedly became elusive, meals were postponed, and the emotional strain manifested in moments of visible tension. Those close to him were struck by the depth of his despair, the intensity of his frustration, and the sharp awareness of what this moment meant both personally and publicly. It was a reminder that titles, while symbolic, carry with them profound emotional resonance within the royal framework. Amid the private turmoil, Harry reportedly began planning his initial public response. Insider accounts suggest that he debated whether to issue a statement, speak through legal channels, or maintain silence until further consultation with advisors. Every option carried risk. Speaking too soon could appear reactive. Waiting too long could create a perception of weakness or passivity. The deliberation underscored the complex interplay between emotion, strategy, and public perception, a challenge few outside the royal sphere could fully grasp. It was a delicate dance between authenticity and prudence, shaped by both personal pain and awareness of historical significance. Harry's private reaction extended beyond himself, influencing interactions with his children and family members. Sources suggest he took time to explain the situation to those closest to him in age-appropriate ways, balancing honesty with protection. The emotional weight of being publicly stripped of a title, juxtaposed against private responsibilities and familial bonds, created a tension that was deeply felt. These moments revealed a human side to the prince often overshadowed by public spectacle. A father grappling with institutional decisions that carried personal consequences for himself and those he loved. The ripple effect of the title removal was also evident in Harry's mental and emotional preparation for media engagement. Trusted aides reportedly began crafting potential responses, rehearsing statements, and simulating interviews to anticipate questions and reactions. Harry's aim was reportedly to assert control over his narrative while remaining composed, empathetic, and dignified. The preparation reflected an acute awareness of the power of public perception, especially when dealing with a matter as sensitive and unprecedented as a royal title being revoked in real time. By the end of the initial hours, Harry's private reaction had solidified into a combination of reflective strategizing and controlled emotional processing. He reportedly took measures to protect his family, monitor media developments, and coordinate with advisors to ensure that the next steps would align with both personal values and long-term objectives. The moment marked a turning point in his relationship with the monarchy, a personal reckoning with authority, loyalty, and identity, and the beginning of a complex narrative that would unfold publicly in the coming days, weeks, and months.